It was a rainy evening on July 15, 2018, when the usually bustling office of Synergy Enterprises in downtown Chicago was eerily silent. The city's skyline was veiled in mist, and most employees had already left for the day. However, a few people remained in the building, wrapping up their work for the week. Among them was 24-year-old Claire Mitchell, an ambitious intern eager to prove herself, and the company's charismatic CEO, Richard Evans. Richard, 45, was known for his sharp business acumen and charming personality. He had built Synergy Enterprises from the ground up, transforming it into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. On the surface, Richard seemed to have it all: a successful career, a beautiful wife, and 2 teenage daughters. But behind closed doors, his life was anything but perfect. His marriage was falling apart, and he was struggling to keep up appearances. Claire, fresh out of business school, had quickly caught Richard's eye. Intelligent, driven, and attractive, she had been assigned to work closely with him on a new project. Their professional relationship soon turned into something more. What began as innocent late-night meetings to discuss business quickly evolved into a secret affair. They would meet in Richard's office after hours, careful to keep their relationship hidden from prying eyes. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and this one would prove to be deadly. That evening, Claire had stayed late to finish some reports. Richard, who had planned to leave early, returned to the office unexpectedly. They found themselves alone, the tension between them palpable. Richard's usually composed demeanor was fraught with anxiety. He confessed to Claire that his wife, Laura, had become suspicious of their affair and had hired a private investigator. He was worried that his entire life was about to come crashing down. Claire, visibly shaken, suggested ending their relationship. She couldn't risk her budding career or the scandal that would follow if their affair became public knowledge. But Richard was desperate. He couldn't let her go, not now, when everything was on the line. He pleaded with her to stay, promising that he would leave his wife and make things right. The argument escalated. Voices rose, and emotions ran high. Claire, overwhelmed, insisted that they end things immediately. She threatened to expose their relationship if he didn't leave her alone. In a moment of blind rage, Richard lost control. He grabbed a letter opener from his desk and, in one swift motion, plunged it into Claire's chest. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Claire's eyes widened in shock as she stumbled backward, clutching her wound. Blood began to seep through her blouse, and she collapsed onto the office floor. Richard stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. Panic set in as he watched the life drain from Claire's body. Realizing the gravity of his actions, Richard knew he had to cover his tracks. He hurriedly wiped his fingerprints off the letter opener and discarded it in a nearby trash can. He then dragged Claire's lifeless body to a secluded corner of the office and hastily concealed it behind some file cabinets, hoping it would buy him some time. He knew he couldn't be seen leaving the office now. He took a deep breath, composed himself, and returned to his desk, pretending to finish some work. After about an hour, he finally left the building, trying to act as normal as possible. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at him as he wished Richard a good night, but Richard's nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, the cleaning staff found Claire's body, and the office was plunged into chaos. The police were called immediately, and Detective Sarah Lawson, a seasoned investigator known for her no-nonsense approach, was assigned to the case. Arriving at the scene, she took in the chaotic environment, the shock on the faces of the employees, the pool of blood where Claire had been found, and the hastily concealed murder weapon. Detective Lawson knew she was dealing with more than just a crime of passion. The calculated attempt to hide the body indicated that the killer had something significant to lose. She needed to unravel the events that had led to this gruesome discovery. She began her investigation. One thing was clear: the murderer was someone close to Claire, someone who had access to the office after hours. And with each passing hour, the pressure to solve the case intensified. Detective Sarah Lawson began her investigation by questioning the staff who had been present in the office the night before. She meticulously reviewed security footage, noting that only a few people had remained in the building after hours. Among them was Richard Evans. His departure time seemed seemed innocent enough, but something about his calm demeanor on camera didn't sit right with her. He left at around 8 p.m., just an hour after Claire's estimated time of death. The first red flag appeared when she learned that Richard had returned to the office that evening after initially leaving early. His reason? He claimed he had forgotten his phone. It was a plausible excuse, but Lawson had heard too many of those before. She decided to have a closer look at his activities that night. She visited Richard's office, now sealed off as a crime scene. The cold, sterile atmosphere contrasted sharply with the chaos that had unfolded. Bloodstains marred the once pristine carpet, and the letter opener used in the murder lay in an evidence bag, smeared with blood. Lawson couldn't shake the feeling that the crime was personal. This wasn't a random act of violence. She needed to dig deeper into Claire's relationship with Richard. Richard was brought in for questioning the next day. He appeared composed, his demeanor cool and collected. He expressed shock and sorrow over Claire's death, describing her as a promising young woman with a bright future. He vehemently denied any involvement in her murder, insisting he had no reason to harm her. Lawson, experienced in reading people, detected something rehearsed in his responses. She pressed him about his return to the office that night. Richard stuck to his story, claiming he had forgotten his phone and had only stayed for a short time to finish some work. His alibi was shaky, but without direct evidence, she couldn't hold him. Determined to find the missing piece, Lawson ordered a thorough search of the office, focusing on any evidence that might have been overlooked. The breakthrough came when the forensics team discovered traces of blood on Richard's desk, partially wiped clean. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but under UV light, the faint smears told a different story. Someone had tried to clean up after the attack. The team also found a small earring under the desk, a delicate gold stud that matched the one Claire had been wearing. It was a significant find, placing Claire in Richard's office during the time of the murder. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Lawson needed more. She decided to speak with Richard's wife, Laura. If she had suspected the affair, she might have information that could help the investigation. Laura was reluctant at first, clearly uncomfortable discussing her marital issues with a stranger, but Lawson's persistence paid off. Laura admitted that she had indeed hired a private investigator, suspecting that Richard was being unfaithful. However, she hadn't received the report yet. All she knew was that Richard had been acting strangely, more secretive and distant. As Lawson continued her questioning, Laura revealed something crucial. The night before Claire's death, Richard had received a call that left him visibly shaken. He had left the house abruptly, claiming he needed to handle an emergency at the office. When he returned, he was agitated and refused to talk about what had happened. Laura hadn't pressed him then, but now she realized it might have been connected to the murder. With this new information, Lawson subpoenaed Richard's phone records. The results were startling. There had been several calls and texts exchanged between Richard and Claire in the hours leading up to her death. The last text, sent by Claire, was chilling. "We need to talk. I'm done with this." It was sent just minutes before the murder. This was the turning point Lawson needed. The evidence was mounting against Richard, but she needed a confession or a direct link to the crime. She decided to set a trap. She arranged for Richard to come in for a follow-up interview under the pretext of clarifying some details. This time, she played her hand carefully, presenting the evidence piece by piece: the blood traces, the earring, the phone records, each revelation chipping away at his composure. Richard's facade began to crumble. He stumbled over his words, his previous confidence waning. Lawson pressed harder, painting a picture of a man whose world was unraveling, who had everything to lose and was desperate to silence the one person who could destroy him. In a final gambit, Lawson revealed that the security cameras from the parking garage had captured him disposing of a small item in the trash. The letter opener, the murder weapon, had been recovered from that very trash can. The weight of the evidence became unbearable. Richard's hands shook as he realized the noose was tightening around him. Desperation set in. He demanded a lawyer, but the damage was done. Lawson had enough to arrest him on suspicion of murder. As he was led away in handcuffs, the reality of his situation finally finally hit him. The empire he had built, the life he had worked so hard to maintain, was crumbling around him, all because of a moment of uncontrollable rage. Richard Evans sat in his cell, the reality of his actions weighing heavily on him. The investigation had moved quickly, and the evidence against him was damning. The final nail in his coffin came when the forensic team analyzed the letter opener. Despite his hasty attempt to clean it, traces of Claire's blood and Richard's fingerprints were found on the handle. The prosecution built a solid case, portraying Richard as a man driven to desperation. The story they pieced together was grim and straightforward. Richard had lured Claire to his office, pleading with her to continue their affair. When she refused and threatened to expose him, he snapped, stabbing her in a fit of rage. His efforts to cover up the crime were as desperate as they were sloppy, revealing a man who had lost control. Detective Lawson continued to uncover more damning evidence. A search of Richard's home office yielded a torn page from his personal journal, dated just a day before the murder. The entry was filled with anger and fear, detailing his paranoia about the affair being exposed and his desperation to maintain his reputation and family. It ended ominously. "I can't let her ruin everything. I have to end this." With this, the prosecution had not only the physical evidence, but also a clear motive. As the trial approached, Richard's legal team scrambled to find a defense, but it was an uphill battle. They tried to paint Claire as a manipulative woman who had threatened Richard's life and career, but the jury wasn't convinced. The text messages showed a young woman desperate to escape a toxic situation, not a scheming blackmailer. The trial was brief. The prosecution presented their evidence meticulously: the blood traces in Richard's office, the recovered letter opener, the phone records, and the damning journal entry. They detailed the events of that fateful night, how Richard had tried to clean up the scene, then discarded the weapon in a panic. Claire's family sat in the courtroom, listening in stunned silence as the details of her last moments were laid bare. Richard's wife, Laura, was a picture of despair, her face pale and drawn. She sat rigidly, refusing to look at the man she had once loved, now reduced to a shadow of himself. When it was Richard's turn to testify, his calm facade was gone. He appeared broken, his voice shaking as he tried to explain himself. He claimed he never meant to kill Claire, that it was an accident, but his story didn't hold. The prosecution reminded the jury that Richard had deliberately brought her to his office, armed with a weapon, and had concealed her body. This wasn't the act of a man who had lost control for a moment. It was calculated, premeditated. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Richard showed no reaction as the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a mix of relief and sorrow. In the aftermath, Laura filed for divorce, severing the last tie to the man who had destroyed their lives. She moved out of state with her daughters, seeking to escape the shadow of Richard's actions. Synergy Enterprises, the company Richard had built, quickly distanced itself from him, appointing new leadership in a desperate bid to salvage its reputation. Detective Lawson felt a grim sense of closure as she watched Richard being led away. She had seen too many cases like this, men who let their desires drive them to madness. But Claire's case would stay with her. The senselessness of it, the way a young woman's life had been taken over a secret that should never have existed, weighed heavily on her. As she left the courtroom, Lawson couldn't help but think of Claire's last moments, the fear she must have felt, the betrayal by a man she had once trusted. But at least now, there was some semblance of justice. Richard Evans, once a powerful CEO, was now a prisoner, his empire in ruins. The affair that had begun in secrecy had ended in tragedy, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives.